Hello. Hello. Lars.
Hi guys.
Hey. You're based out of Germany, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Lars? Nice. Actually,
I
you
am,
too,
me
aren't
too.
you? Nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Where you from, Lucas?
From Münster.
Sorry, come again?
From Münster. And how about you?
Münster, Berlin.
Okay. And professionally, where do you come from then?
I work with eBay for 10 years now.
Oh, okay.
So,
All right. We'll just give people a couple minutes to join. I'll grab the notes too and share them. So feel free to add any agenda item if you haven't already. Let's see. Hey, James. Hey, Kavindu.
Hi, gang. How is everyone?
Yeah, wonderful. How you doing? How's the new house?
I'm convinced a witch lived here before I did.
Makes sense.
I've taken some pictures. It feels a little bit, yeah. I need my
Looks like
roommate
you're in
to
a
arrive.
closet.
Also, the floor's like bowing really badly, so I put my wardrobe up, and like at the top, like the gap was like that much while it was touching the wall at the bottom, like a really menacing lean over my bed. So
Yeah, what could go wrong?
yeah. If I don't come up, if I don't turn up in 2 weeks' time, I'm in the bed under a wardrobe.
All right, let's see here. I think we could probably get started in a second. I just shared the notes in the Zoom chat. And there's not a ton of agenda items. So if anyone has anything, please feel free to do it. And then go ahead and add yourself as a participant. And is there any volunteer for Scribe? If not, I'm happy to do it today. I haven't done it in a while, so. But I don't want to take that opportunity away from anyone.
We should wait a couple minutes too, I think, because last meeting at least there's a whole bunch of people that joined like in the first couple minutes after 10, if I remember correctly.
Okay. I mean, we could probably get started with some of it, and if we have to circle back on a couple
That's true.
topics, then so be it. All right. Perfect. Yeah. Definitely feel free to add any topics that you have if there's anything in particular you want to talk about. But for now, looks like Todd's got some spec updates I want to cover quickly.
Yeah, so things have been going pretty well with the spec, especially recently. We've merged a lot of stuff. Init and shutdown got merged. Events has the requisite number of approvals. I haven't heard a lot of like concerns at this point, or I guess I should say that a lot of the concerns with the spec have been addressed. Like there were some good points brought up by various people, late last of which is probably Kavindu. Thanks, Kavindu. But yeah, I'm feeling pretty confident with what we have now. I think that we can probably merge events at the end of the week. Like I was thinking about doing it tomorrow. And that'll leave us in a place where we have basically 4 big new topics to release with spec 060. And I've noted them there in the notes. So it's events, init and shutdown, multi-provider support, and flag metadata. So basically we'll be releasing spec 060 with all those things. Everything should be continuing along that with our pattern so far. Everything should be backwards compatible. So providers that ideally providers that were designed for older versions of the spec should work just fine with newer releases of SDKs. I mean, that's kind of up to the SDK implementer, but that's the idea. Things have kind of been spec'd in that with that in mind. And that's how the experimental web SDK, which implements almost all of this stuff, works. So yeah, the plan is to merge the events, and then I'm going to be creating issues in basically every SDK repo with like a high level issue describing those kind of 4 things that need to be implemented, and people can just have at it. I've had a number of maintainers or contributors kind of volunteer already to take over those issues or to help with those issues. So that's exciting. Thanks to everybody who's doing that. But yeah, basically 060 coming down the pipe probably next week, unless I hear concerns about events or the release in general before that. Anybody have any comments or questions on that topic? Concerns? Okay. Yeah, and then the last thing I want to talk about, which should be pretty quick, the current playground demo, which is something that we show a lot at KubeCon. Sometimes we show it in the community meetings every once in a while. It was kind of designed to be a good place to experiment with the spec and providers and some of our concepts. Yeah, I think from the very beginning, it wasn't really designed to be a showpiece. So it doesn't look amazing, right? It's not very flashy. It's designed really to allow us to experiment with providers and functionality. It's not cool looking. I'm speaking next month at the New York City DevOps Days, and one of the things I wanted to do was kind of do a demo for a use case that gets really good traction when I talk about it. And it's a real use case for feature flags that I experienced at one of my past companies, which is like, basically you have a whole bunch of countries or jurisdictions with different regulations, and you're like slowly kind of onboarding them onto a new feature. And it really shows like user targeting well. I think it's like an interesting use case that really helps people understand how a remotely managed feature flag platform can really increase the speed of delivery and also the confidence of delivery of new features. So it just really connects well. So I think basically my idea is to create a cool looking demo kind of around that concept that will use some of the same underlying playground components. So we'll still be able to switch providers and vendors live, but it'll look flashier, it'll present better, and it could be something that I use in that talk. And that's feedback we've heard too from like other, like for example, so one of the OTel maintainers was kind of talking to Mike and I about this, like how the playground is cool for playing around in and building things. It doesn't actually demo the real benefits of feature flags too well. Yeah, so which I think is absolutely true. So that's basically what I'm working on improving. So yeah, not much of a call to action there, but if anybody has any interesting ideas, you can ping me about that. I think that's all I had. Any comments about that one?
It may make sense to create an issue then in the playground, because then we could get some feedback, and if you have any mock-ups or whatever, we can just start throwing them in there, because I think it's a pretty interesting one. Especially because you could start showing, like, I mean, if you think of like a map or whatever, you show a map of Europe and you're doing the GDPR stuff and you see like the little dots change color as you're updating rule sets and whatever, like it could be a really cool demo, but it could be something that we could kind of collaborate on in some issues somewhere, probably in the demo app.
Yeah, that's basically what you described is kind of what I'm thinking. And I think we could even build like a little tour on top of it or something, where it's like, okay, now enable the feature for these geos. Oh, we just got advice from legal that this geo needs to be added. And yeah, you'd see like dots plotted on the map, some that are in violation of like some legal restriction that you have to then correct with a feature flag, and you could see that deploy, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the idea, but good call on the issue. I'll create an issue and I'll maybe put some mock-ups in there and see what people think. But That's kind of my plan.
Cool. Sounds good. Just a reminder, I'm going to paste in the notes here. So if anyone has any agenda items, we're already halfway through it. So yeah, definitely probably move fairly quickly. The next one, I'm really trying to get a sense of how important others think this would be. Personally, I think it would be extremely useful. We're even using it in our playground application right now. And it's the idea of like request scope, like context propagation. And so basically like in something like Node, you'd use like a continuous local storage or some technique like that. In Java, they have like thread local storage and other similar concepts. These concepts apply across a lot of different tools. And so thinking about like, if you're thinking a targeting key or a user identifier or something is very important in a feature flag, it's really unfortunate, tedious, and sometimes not possible to pass it into each flag evaluation. So if you could basically shove it on the request at like in the auth tier, and have it basically automatically merged as part of like, a flag evaluation in the scope of a single request, how valuable that is to people. Like I said, it's already in the demo application and we've already had an OFEP approved for that. It's just like making sure people find it interesting and then writing spec for it, and then basically implementing it, of course, in the different languages. So the nice part is then like any vendor and tool would all benefit from this, and you kind of get it for free across all different SDKs. So kind of open it up to that one. That would also be a prereq for a more advanced use case, which I think would be really interesting. It's also in the playground application, but basically we're using OpenTelemetry baggage to propagate context across services. And so basically the idea is like if you have a auth tier as part of like a pretty advanced like microservice architecture, we could shove like the user identifiers on the context and it could propagate basically automatically across tiers. And so this like transaction context propagation is like a prereq to that. But I want to see like, I think it's, if nothing else, a really cool demo, but is it like a realistic scenario? Like if you're in these like highly complex, microservice architectures and you need context that isn't currently available in like a downstream service, is this interesting? Because it's doable. It's just a matter of like, do we want to put in the effort to make this happen?
I guess my opinion on that is you're kind of, I guess, changing something that's kind of explicit to implicit, right? Like you're kind of like changing this like implicit thing where you have to pass around this user data and have it available to something that's kind of like happening automatically in the background. And there's definitely value in that in higher level languages. I'm not sure like if folks in like lower level languages would be cool with that. Like I think they tend to like things to be more explicit than that. Like so that's one where I have. And also it's just like the challenges whenever I've tried to do like kind of magic things like that in the past is that it makes like debugging more difficult and other things like that. And it's less obvious to the end user, like where that data is coming from. And when you have to debug sort of like, why don't I have the right context here, right? Like, why is this flag getting evaluated with the wrong context? And like, because it's kind of behind this layer of indirection, it can be challenging. It makes for a really clean demo though, like for sure. Like you can make a much cleaner demo.
I wonder if it's even beyond demo though. It's just like how, like if you have to use a feature flag in some service right now, it doesn't have access to user metadata. Like, are you going to update like the method signature to pass that in just for feature flagging purposes? That to me seems unclean too. Like I hear what you're saying too. There's
it depends on the structure. Like a lot of structure, there's like a request scope, right? Like in a lot of languages, there's like it's all handled around like handling some HTTP request, right? And so it's like there's a request scope that's passed along, and that's kind of like the global scope for that request in a lot of languages. But
I had kind of the same thoughts that Jonathan had. Like, for example, I was thinking about how I would maybe, for example, use it as you said in a node and maybe with Nest.js below it or so. I was just wondering there. I would personally, I think I would go for something like using what Nest.js gives me for that, for having the scope and giving it down there, and like, for example, in a repository or whatever, or in a service, using it. But
Mm.
I'm not sure if this is just how I currently think it is, or if it's just nice to have it optional.
Well,
in
that's
the
kind of the thing. So
spec.
actually in our demo,
Yeah.
we're using Nest and we're doing both. We're doing like
Yeah.
a client per request as one proof of
Mhm.
concept, because like the clients are relatively cheap in OpenFeature. We can create
Yeah,
them
yeah.
and basically use it as a request scoped thing. We also do it as part of like a request scoped like merging. So like it shows kind of both options. And this is kind of like an optional part. So I just don't know how we could, well, there's partially like OpenFeature was sort of designed like that, which is why we didn't have targeting key as like a required argument at flag evaluation, is so you could pass it in at different tiers. You know, like you could create like a user scoped client if you really wanted to. So like, but I also do understand that it could be kind of potentially a little magical because we're merging context from multiple places. So we also have hooks though, so you could see where a lot of these, like what the context is at different tiers, and manipulate it if you want to, or debug it. So yeah.
When I first started thinking about this proposal, I had the same reaction as basically Lucas, where I was like, well, I can use whatever the IOC framework I'm working with provides, right? So, if it's Spring, you got injection that way. If it's Nest, like Lucas mentioned, then you do that way. On the other hand, if you're not using any of those frameworks, it would kind of be nice to have the ability to kind of leverage built-ins and OpenFeature to accomplish the same thing. I mean, certainly that's what OpenTelemetry has done, but there is maintenance. I'm not sure how hard it would be to spec out, because it's kind of wildly different in a lot of languages, but I think you could do it in a general way that would probably be consistent. But yeah, I have to think about that more. I don't know. I see the pros and cons. I'm open to it. The baggage thing is particularly interesting to me. Yeah, I'm not sure. And maybe I don't know if we merged the OFEP, so I'm not sure where, if there was room for more discussion on this, I'm not sure where we would put it, but
Would that
yeah,
even be
I mean, I see
possible
both
in like
sides.
Go?
I think you
think it'd
would
be on
use
the
the context
context.
and Go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is explicit, but it's passed everywhere. If you're doing Go right, you always have the context. So that's kind of where it would be stored, I guess. I don't know if anybody who's more who's better at Go than me could comment more, but
I think it's a little bit taboo to be passing values around in context, though. While you can do it, you shouldn't really do it. If we're talking about context, as in context, not evaluation context, if I'm following.
we're talking about putting basically evaluation context in context.
Okay, so I think we just have something to think about. There is an OFEP, it was closed and merged at some point, but like I was just trying to gauge interest in this, partially because I really want to see if we can explore the baggage propagation, partially because I really think that that's an interesting use case in like highly distributed like microservice environments, so that you may need things like targeting keys or user identifiers and stuff that aren't available on downstream services, and you're not gonna update the contract between the two to to send that information. So yeah, just think about it. I guess we can always circle back, and it is part of the demo app, so if you want to take a look at how it was like implemented there, definitely.
Yeah. Mike, can you quickly share the OFEP? So I think it's the
yeah, of course.
the transaction context propagation, right? So maybe.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll share that with the group. And then yeah, feel free to take a look at it and let me know what you think. Here it is. And I'll add it to the notes. Cool. The next one that I had is basically like right now we're experimenting with using an OpenTelemetry hook to capture both basically to extend a trace with span events. So that's one, and that works just fine. and also to create some basic like impression metrics. And so both of those would be like optional hooks that you can install if you'd like to. The one thing that became fairly apparent to me as we're going through this is a lot of tools have basically you have like your feature flag and it's like a base flag that's like overridden per environment. So you'd have like, I don't know, my new feature, and you'd say in dev, it's enabled, in hardening, it's enabled, but has these rules, and in production, it's off, right? And so if we're collecting those metrics based on the information that we currently have access to in the SDKs, we don't have like environment or project or organization like awareness, I guess, if that makes sense. So as part of the upcoming spec changes, there's already like a ability for providers to provide there's a lot of provides in that. Providers can supply flag metadata. And so theoretically, like a provider could say, this is part of, like the managed, this is the, unique identifier for this, version, I suppose, of this feature flag in this environment, which would then allow you to like slice and dice like metrics and traces and stuff, and hopefully get it back to the specific place in like a management UI where it was, where it's defined. So I guess I just want to like kind of throw that out there, because like part of it is like currently it's just like a kind of a key value pair is what that flag metadata is, but we may want to consider like, do we do something kind of like a semantic convention like an OTel and say like, if you supply a scope or a environment or whatever we want to call that, it can apply to like telemetry hooks to basically have some awareness of like where this came from. So
basically you're saying like find a way to add in a standard way, add that as a dimension on the.
Yeah, more or less. Like we need at the end of the day for these like if you think of like an impression metric, for that to be useful, we would have to have some kind of additional filter to know that this was for the dev environment as part of a specific project or whatever. If the management tool supports that type of use case, which a lot of them do. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or opinion on that.
I mean, that could also, correct me if I'm wrong, but that could also come from, could that also come from the like the application author themselves? Like even if that information is not coming from the flag management system, if the workload itself is aware of what environment it's in, it could populate that same dimension, and then you'd have the same information, whether it's
it could,
from the flag.
Yeah, it could. Because like I think when you think of it from an application author, like they would have to supply like a SDK token or whatever the tool deems to call that, and that has awareness of like the project and environment and all that stuff. So I guess you could say that is reasonable to say like a user should at that point know that this is for the dev environment and whatever. We could certainly do that. It still kind of goes back though, like we'd have to have that metadata have some specific name so that these like different like analytics hooks and logging hooks and stuff, like if it comes across and it's named this, we can do something special with it. That similar to the way OTel's doing it with their attributes.
This seems very similar to the API level context that we have, where you can set that static context, I think we might call it, that we know at like application.
It could. Yep, you could do that. So, but I think it's really about like the sort of, and maybe this is jumping slightly too far ahead, but I just kind of want to plant the seed that like we'll have the ability after this next spec release to have a provider supply metadata to like after hooks, for example. In that after hook, having awareness of like the scope of that feature flag and where it was managed and that type of stuff could be extremely valuable. So thinking about like if we apply some kind of like semantic awareness around it, then it becomes more useful like generally for these like after hooks to do things with it. So yeah. Yep, that's
generally that makes sense to me. Like we do environments and project level stuff, and I assume that like variation data would get attached to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we already have dimensions and awareness of like what variant it is, what the flag key is, all that type of stuff. But like, then it would be like an aggregate of dev hardening and prod, or dev hardening pre-prod and prod, or whatever, which is not really what you'd be looking for if you're looking to like slice and dice like impression metrics or whatever other data you'd like to see. Because what we'd really like to do is have these couple like, generic OTel hooks that you can register. And if the metadata is like, consistent across tools, then it's like you could pipe that into Prometheus and look at it, and you could aggregate it across all environments, or slice it down to single environments or single servers that had the impression or whatever. Like you can start filtering on all those different dimensions that are captured. Just out of curiosity, like in the dev cycle SDK, would it already have like environment awareness somewhere in there? Or is that just handled based on the auth token, and like the server just sends like the rule set without that?
Yeah, it's part of the project data that we send back to the SDKs would have it in part of our configuration file. So it's not something I don't think we expose. Not sure. I don't think we expose it to the end user right now, but within the SDK, we have it. We could probably expose it as part of this to the provider pretty easily. So
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess just think about that one, because I'm really, even if we do end up doing that, I think the challenge would be, what would we want to call some of those properties? Or like, because like I think that even becomes semi-controversial, because not everyone has environments, certainly not everyone uses projects. Like there's applications and work groups and namespaces and all that stuff.
As I'm not too experienced in doing that spec work, so for example, we had that also with the events. Like there to me the question was, how much do we want to define, for example, optional fields that may exist, as we have with the error message, for example. It feels to me that it makes much sense, but again, it feels to me, so I'm not 100% sure on where to find the trade-off between like defining something that implementers can rely on and just going that far. How would we generally handle that in this case? For example, yeah, it's what you said, like we may define something like this, but I think it's fine to have an environment in there, because it's something that is pretty familiar to most, even if you're not using it. But still,
yeah, I guess that is the big question. It's like, I personally like the idea of some kind of like, I think OTel did a really nice job with semantic convention. Honestly, it's like they allow you to send like key value pairs, but if you send it in this pattern, it has like special meaning. And I think we could do something very similar here and just say like, you can send whatever you want, but if you supply environment, then all of a sudden like these hooks can take advantage of it in some useful way. And so, yeah, figuring out what we call those will be slightly challenging probably. But I think it's worth, investigating, seeing what we can do. And because then it's at least nudging people in the right way too. Otherwise you're offloading a lot of work on the provider to come up with like their own names. And as most people know, naming is difficult. And if your concepts roughly match to like a project or whatever, like just use project. Like I know it may not be the same terminology that you use in your tool, but I think, people can understand that you have to have a common mapping for these. So.
Yeah, totally. And I think that makes total sense, because otherwise you cannot rely on anything in the end. And you could not build such a thing, but it feels a bit like we would do it in a way, then we see a use case for this. Yeah, I think you would do this based on use cases, right? Like if you can say, okay, this makes sense to, and we think that that's not too special, it should maybe be included, right?
Yeah, that's what I would kind of think. Like we could even say things like, just as an example, you could say issue tracker or something like that, or issue ID or something like that, if you wanted to have Jira issues associated with it. Or you could have management URLs or identifier. Like we could come up with those things that kind of tie back to use cases. Like as a user of OpenFeature, I'd like to be able to, like, if something went wrong with the logs, know who created it or whatever, and then you could define those semantics around that. Yeah. looks like someone took over scribe duty. Sorry about that. I was too passionate about metric dimension. So thanks, Todd. But yeah, anything else on that? I just kind of wanted to throw that out there, that I think that there's some interesting opportunities. But I do think you're right that both events and something like flag metadata could benefit from some kind of like semantic. You're not required to do it, of course, but if you happen to follow this pattern, like, you know, then it can work with some of these like community built hooks, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, makes total sense.
I guess this is a tag on, which, you know, I don't know if it's good to bring it up or not, but we could do similar things with context. You know, it might be the same attributes, but context is a bag right now, with the exception of targeting key. We could use the same conventions for context as an idea.
Yeah, we
That's
had
kind of
talked
what
about.
I ended up doing with the dev cycle stuff last week, was that I basically just like I defined like, here are the properties that like dev cycle like knows about, and then like we'll pull out of the context into our own object, and everything else will just sort of dump into our generic sort of like object pool of keys that you can set.
Yeah, and that's the thing it would formalize, because not every like flag management system has special meanings. Like some of them are just bags and there's no special things, and then some have these special, you know, attributes, and having a kind of defined mapping for those attributes could be helpful. It would make your job with documenting that very, very clear, right?
And one thing we're working on is custom, like being able to define those types for your organization. So it's kind of outside of this, but one thing we're working on is like being able to actually define your schemas, like using JSON schema and a couple other schemas, like being able to define your schemas for certain variable value types, or for certain custom user data, and actually being able to enforce that like in your application, so that like your developers don't go and use stuff that doesn't apply to your type. So happy to like talk about that more in the future. But
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that we had talked about at one point, about having some kind of like compiler aware, you know, feature flagging option. So it's certainly something I'd like to dive into, maybe at a later point for sure. I remember when we first talked about context though, like we very intentionally, because we were originally thinking it would be really nice to have, you know, whatever, these 10 commonly used types, like kind of defined but optional. And there was a bit of controversy around that, I would say. So that's why we decided to just do targeting rules at the moment. But maybe it could even like, and this is more in like TypeScript, but you could easily make it so you could just supply your own generic or something on top of that. Maybe we just have to expose some like little like, you know, okay, thanks, Justin. Some like little things depending on the language, right? There's some pretty nice ways to add this like kind of quality of life improvements to certain, you know, developers of certain languages. And then I think if you're writing Go, you're just used to it being a crappy experience anyways, right, James?
I was going to swear, but this is recorded.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Anything else then? Feel free to add something to the agenda if you want to. Otherwise, we can probably go ahead and wrap it up soon.
One question that I had regarding Web SDK and the Node SDK. Currently, it feels, and to be honest, I don't know if there's information on it that I don't know. But it feels a bit annoying to have two JavaScript SDKs basically. And it feels like I'm actually not sure. I said to Todd that I would like to contribute on the JavaScript SDK, because it's just something that I want to use, and yeah, there's room to do something on this. And there, the question came to me: how is then done, like having the Web SDK and the JavaScript SDK? How, like, do we really do them in parallel and try to keep them in sync, or is it going to be one SDK later, or how are we continuing on that?
Yeah, so basically the TLDR for why there's two is because we did a lot of work, and I can point you to the OFEPs, but we did a lot of work in research in kind of surveying the landscape for most SDKs, and found that the vast majority of and then we did some surveys too, also to kind of gather this data, but the vast majority of vendors have different web versus Node SDKs, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is because they have different dependencies and they're different runtimes. That's pretty obvious. Like local storage exists in the browser, it doesn't exist in Node, and there's a million similar examples. Vice versa, or in the same way, or vice versa. And the other thing is, fundamentally, the client is just different. It's usually a single user context, so you're operating in the context of one kind of person, generally speaking. Whereas in the server, like if we're talking about a web server, every request, or to be more general, every event could constitute a different user or context or service or whatever. So it's like, basically we have a dynamic context paradigm, which is what we implement on the server, and then a more static context paradigm, which is what we would be encouraging clients to implement. And that's what the Web SDK implements. And there's an OFEP that details this, as well as a blog post by Pete Hodgson from OpenFeature about our thinking around this. Like philosophically, it's basically what I just described. Practically, from the JavaScript side, I don't know if you looked at the SDK, we do have some documentation on it, but the way it exists is there's some common types, and then there's basically like 2 submodules that inherit from those that extend those common types. So we publish it all basically from one repo. They share the common bases, and what would have to happen when we release 6.0, because a lot of this is implemented in the Web SDK right now, the experimental one, is we'd be pulling a lot of the stuff that's already implemented there into the common bits. At least I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, totally, and that makes total sense. And basically, that's what I said. I'm not sure if there's the information, and it just came to my mind that I had this question.
Yeah,
makes sense.
That blog post is really good if you haven't read it. And I also say the context is that most of the client-side use cases are API driven, where like the client-side JS SDKs and most providers are making web requests to some service to get their evaluations, versus like most Node.js implementations are trying to do a lot of that evaluation locally in most cases, like locally within the Node.js. So like there's also like structurally most SDKs are kind of built differently. Like for example, like we use sort of a common WebAssembly, like we pull down a config file to our Node.js SDK and then use like a WebAssembly code base to like do the evaluations locally. So you don't have to, like, you don't want every request going to your Node.js backend to make a web request to a server, right? Like that just doesn't scale. So there's also like structural differences with how a lot of the SDKs are set up.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. So in that case, totally get why.
Yep, I linked the blog post. There was one other question that Jonathan brought up that I linked in here. Basically, we have a JS SDK and a web SDK. And that's come up a few times. Like the logic originally, I think from the very get-go, we called it the Node SDK. But then it was like, well, Node's not the only server runtime. And it's like, do we create a bun one eventually? Do we create a Deno one? So it was like, we just keep it JS, but it maybe is confusing. So like, I'm not sure what, like, and we don't even technically support any of the other runtimes yet. We haven't tested that. So yeah, curious to get your thoughts on that.
And for example, us as a provider, like we're working on like a serverless one, SDK too, but it may make sense for it to be a different SDK for us, like to package it differently, because it might be cleaner for us to package that as a separate SDK for our customers. We're using it that way. And then the question is like, how do we make that work with like the provider? Then we have to like add some logic into our provider to be like, which one do we import? And so that's I understand the idea of trying to make like an isomorphic like JavaScript provider, but like I think most of the underlying SDKs are somewhat specific. Like I think a lot of there's like a Cloudflare Worker SDK, and there's like a Node SDK, and there's like a Deno SDK, and like some of those use a lot of the same underlying stuff, but I think a lot of providers package them differently.
Which we could do now with the mono repo if we wanted to, I suppose.
Yeah, for that one, I actually had in mind that it may make sense to have then the providers being maybe more technology specific, but the SDK not. But the other rest of the explanation like makes it irrelevant, like because that makes sense then anyways, even if you could do it on the provider side.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
go ahead, Ty. No,
I was just gonna say I added to the notes the web SDK like subfolder in the JS repo, like submodule and the npm module, which again is experimental. Like it's being published as a dash experimental version now because it basically implements a lot of the stuff in the spec that isn't official yet. And I'm sure there's going to be breaking changes and stuff like that. But we do have some providers, some even in production for this. But we've been very careful to say this is experimental.
Cool. I do think it's something to think about though. It's come up quite a few times, the kind of confusion there. It's like, I think the repo being JS SDK is probably totally fine, but maybe the artifacts or something could be more like, if we're only going to test for Node, we should probably just call it Node, maybe potentially in the artifact. So something to talk about, I
I'm
guess.
gonna undeprecate that package.
Maybe, I don't know. It's back. Yeah, I don't know. So something to think
Yeah,
about.
for example, we have a mono repo for our JS SDKs that like has like outputs Node and now the OpenFeature provider and like React Native, like JS. Like I think there's 6 different packages all from one JS SDK mono repo, which is fine, but it's just like, yeah, like the repo can be one thing, but like, yeah, having multiple like outputs is I think okay.
Yeah, makes sense. Something we'll have to think about, Todd. I don't know. It's just tricky. I think in terms of like, because it's probably like the Deno one potentially could be exactly the same, and so figuring out like, do we just like publish the same artifact twice or what? But it's something to consider, especially if it's going to be another kind of point of confusion.
I think now that Deno supports like Node packages a bit better, it's probably not as big of a problem, but something to play with probably.
Yeah, and I think Bun basically works too. Like it may just work, so maybe it's just worth testing, and we just call it like, be more explicit about like this is the server SDK or something. No, at any rate, okay. Yeah. Anything else?
One more point of interest I wanted to add on to this discussion, just for anybody here who's interested, the kind of static context that the web SDK implements is already in the draft spec PR, but very soon, once we've merged all the existing PR changes and release them, like I was talking about, I will open an actual spec PR talking about static context, which won't affect any of the server-side SDKs, but would be the kind of the basis for building more, the web SDK would comply to it and would be the basis for building other client SDKs like mobile SDKs. Or that's the idea. So if you're interested in mobile, especially, I think that could be relevant to you.
All right, sounds good. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up. Perfect. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice
Thanks.
day. I'll talk to you later. See ya.
See you.